Welcome to the 2018 Uglobal EB5 Investors Magazine Immigration Convention in Los Angeles. My fellow panelists and I appreciate your taking the time and joining us this morning. Without further delay, let's start our panel. Today, we're joined by a distinguished group of panelists, each an expert in their field of specialization. Let's start with Mr. Emre Özgü. Focusing on employment-based immigration since his legal career began in 1997, Mr. Özgü has developed an outstanding reputation in the who's who legal for corporate immigration lawyers. He received his BA in economics from Lehigh University in 1994 and his JD from New York Law School in 1997, and is admitted to practice in the state of New York, New Jersey, and the U.S. District Court for the Eastern and Southern Districts of New York. As a partner and co-managing member of Barst, Kamal and Kleiner LLP's EB5 practice since its inception, he has, since 1999, successfully represented numerous immigrant investors and is one of only a handful of U.S. immigration lawyers who have successfully represented Turkish EB5 investors. A member of the American Immigration Lawyers Association, AILA, Mr. Özgü has served on the AILA EB5 New York Chapter, Corporate Practice, and District Director Liaison Committees. He is a past member of the Turkish American Chamber of Commerce and Turkish American Business Forum.
Emre, as far as the history of marketing EB5 in Turkey, do we have any rough statistics that you're aware of that you can enlighten us on how many people from Turkey, since the inception of the program, have received green cards through EB5? Most investors who have received their permanent green cards must have also received their funds back. Do we know of any cases where investors either have been denied green cards or have not been repaid after conditions were removed? Take it away.
Thank you, Marko. Can you hear me? This is working good. I think since the beginning of the program until now, if we're counting direct investment and the regional seller models, you're still looking at less than probably 100 applicants who have gone through the entire process or are at various stages of the process, whether it's the 526 or 829. So I think in total, the numbers are still relatively low. I've been talking to Turkish clients about EB5 for 10, 15, 20 years. It's really only been the last 3 or 4 years that we've started to see some traction. I think in 2017, you saw a fairly significant uptick. I think the expectation was that in 2018 that was going to double. I think there have been some recent events in Turkey, and most notably the devaluation of the Turkish lira, which has sort of changed the market for Turkish investors when it comes to respect to the EB5 program. But I still think that we're still early on in the sort of momentum cycle of EB5 and Turkey. You're starting to hear some success stories from start to finish, which really goes a long way in this market. A lot of it is sort of copycat referrals from friends, and now that we've sort of gone through that initial cycle, I think you're going to see a lot more people willing to pull the trigger and actually go ahead with it. So I'm still optimistic that the numbers will go up. Fortunately, I have not heard of any negative stories with respect to people who've gone through the program, have not received their money, have not received their cards. The Turkish media has done a pretty good job of covering EB5. Unfortunately, most of the stories that you'll find in Turkish media are cautionary stories, not with respect to any Turkish investors in general, but just sort of copying the negative coverage that the program gets here and around the world. And so there's a little bit of skepticism. So it does take a while to educate that Turkish investor and sort of build up that confidence for them to go ahead and pull the trigger on the program. But I think the numbers are trending upwards. I would expect that by the end of 2018, we will have crossed over 100 visa EB5 applicants.
Thank you so much, Emre. The next question I would like to pose to Sevil Özışık. Sevil Özışık's practice focuses on the immigration-related needs of employers in industries including technology, real estate, finance, energy, hospitality, transportation, manufacturing, logistics, and multimedia. Her representation includes outstanding researchers, extraordinary ability, foreign nationals, and those seeking national interest waivers. Ms. Özışık is experienced in AB5 investor visas and works with investors from Turkey, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, Philippines, China, Korea, India, and many other countries. She's a member of AILI and American Bar Association. She's a licensed attorney in both New York and Istanbul. Ms. Özışık is an active member of Turkish-American business community. She has been a selected member to serve on Turkey's Overseas Citizens Advisory Board, a prestigious international advisory panel since 2012, and served as executive board member of American Regional Committee of the World Turkish Business Council, and president and board member of Turkish-American Chamber of Commerce and Industry, commonly known as TACI. In terms of source of funds, which obviously is in the head of just about everybody that is applying for this visa from Turkey, it's the greatest challenge for Turkish investors. There are three categories of funds that can be used for EB5 investments, as we all know. They are their own funds, collateralized borrowings, and finally gifts. Many are confused as to who is actually eligible to provide a gift and how the donor's source of funds would be tracked. I'm sure each panelist has extensive experience and word of advice on this topic. Could we have a primer on this very important topic? Finally, could we also touch upon some of the other challenges Turkish investors specifically might face aside from source of funds?
Thank you, Marko. Can everyone hear me?
Press.
Impressive.
Thanks, Eva.
I think what's very sweet about my clients, especially the Turkish clients, that when we talk about the source of the funds, then I would explain, if you would start the case, EB5 case, it's most important to prove that the money is earned by legal means, and we need certain documents to prove. And they say always so eagerly that of course my money is legal, and most of the time they do have significant amounts deposited at the bank or saved at home as cash or invested in real estate properties. But whenever we would start to talk about documenting the requirements in compliance with the immigration, then it becomes this unbelievable difficult map to go through. I myself find it a little bit easier to educate the clients. Maybe it is also because I have the law degree in Turkey as well, besides here, that I would know the legal requirements, and I always find it a little bit easier to work with CPAs, talented CPAs, to document the legal source of the funds. And even though gifts are common among the family members, once we start to go through the document requirements for the person who would be providing the gift, most of the time parents, in my experience, it becomes unbearable, especially for elderly generation, to document their background. From my personal experiences, it's much more common in Turkey, especially, to focus for the source of the funds, real estate investments, or the estates received from parents, or even the bank loans are, much more easier to deal with. And I think related to source of the funds, the most significant challenge that I find that almost no one files personal tax returns in Turkey, that there is not such a practice. Even though corporations may have very strong tax returns, I always try to find the ways, especially for business owners, maybe as long as they would be willing to pay the taxes, use the corporate tax returns, and go through the dividends for the owners to prove the legal source of the funds. And among the other challenges related to real estate sales, what's more difficult is that most of the real estate contracts may not have the real sale amounts, and when it comes to documented, with the sense that it needs to be approved with the immigration service, we may have problems. So I would still say that Turkish investors have a long way to be educated related to the legal source of the funds. And I'm hoping that more educated migration agents will continue to work in Turkey to prepare them before they would come to the attorneys, so then the cases would move a little bit faster. Thank you.
Thank you, Sevim. Moving along, if I may ask Emre one more question. Could you comment on the composition of the Turkish investor? How many are students studying in U.S. universities? And what percentage have advanced degrees working in Turkey or overseas? And do you have any particular advice for marketing specifically for a Turkish audience?
I think that most Turkish EB5 investors fall into one of two categories. One, it's the F1 student who's approaching OPT or is in OPT and sees the writing on the wall when it comes to the H-1B quota mess. I have a number of those clients that we landed this year. The word is out on that, and a lot of the parents, when they come visit their children, will schedule consultations to go over it, because I think the word is out, and they understand that after investing $200,000-300,000 on a U.S. education, that the EB5 program doesn't seem all that expensive if we're talking about being able to stay, live, and work in the United States.
Thank you, Emre. The next question I would like to ask to John Driscoll. John Driscoll is of counsel with Carter, Ledyard, and Milburn LLP, a New York law firm. He received his BA from Harvard, his MA from the London School of Economics, and his JD from the New York University School of Law. He specializes in legal services to a global client base with respect to their U.S. investments and businesses, and represents some of the largest companies in Turkey with respect to U.S. legal matters. He's admitted to the New York State Bar, the U.S. District Court, Eastern District of New York, and the U.S. District Court, Southern District of New York, as well as the U.S. Court of Appeals, Federal Circuit. He is a Vice President of the Turkish American Chamber of Commerce and a member of the American Turkish Society. He has lectured on U.S. business law and corporate matters at the Istanbul Chamber of Commerce and is fluent in Turkish and French. John, many of our clients also want to know how they could plan ahead regarding the tax implications of EB5, and finally, the green card. Do you think the tax treaty between Turkey and the U.S. is useful to encourage EB5 investors? And is it possible to plan tax complications for a wealthy investor while I-526 is pending? For example, if an investor owned real estate and marketable securities at historically low cost, in Turkey, those assets become exempt from capital gains tax after 5 years. However, once the investor becomes a green card holder, upon sale of the asset, the capital gains tax is calculated using the historical cost of the asset for U.S. tax purposes. What word of advice could we give these folks to get prepared? Also, could you please elaborate on the differing tax treatment of each visa type, highlighting to us the advantages and disadvantages of each? Take it away, John. Thank you.
Okay, well, I'll boil down my answer to a couple of sentences. I think that, as Sevil and Emery have said, the Turkish people that they encounter who are interested in EB-5 typically are people who know a lot about the United States. For many, many years before China started sending students to the United States, the Turkish students who constitute one of the largest communities of graduate students in the United States. So Turks have a lot of familiarity with the United States. The concept of tax is not, requires a cultural adjustment for them, but they're aware of the issues. So I think if you're marketing services to Turkish clients that have tax implications, you really have to, first of all, know a lot about how the tax laws work, and also have consultants at your fingertips that you can recommend to people, because you're talking, the categories of people that you're dealing with, they know the basics about taxation, and sometimes you'll get very detailed questions, which of course you can't answer, and you have to be able to make referrals to people who can answer the questions. With respect to the tax treaty, there is a lot of sort of basic misunderstanding among Turks about the tax treaty, because they don't, when they hear treaty and tax, that a lot of them think that it means they have to pay tax twice, which is not exactly, it was not really the case, because you get a credit for taxes that you do pay in Turkey. But of course, if you come from a background where you're not used to paying taxes at all, then it's not really a question of paying twice, it's paying once that you weren't paying before. So there's a lot of, you have to really invest in long-term education. I think the big issue, a lot of these people have wealth accumulated through real estate, and in Turkey, if you own real estate for 5 years, there's no gain when you sell it. So there are lots of issues about that. People don't necessarily want to liquidate a portfolio. Timur is going to talk to you about various trusts that can be set up to address that problem. But it becomes a little bit complicated. But in the long run, I think you can, if you can answer these questions, people are not afraid of the United States. They know a lot about what it's like to live here. It's just a question of being able to provide them with the information they need.
Thanks, John, for those very informative comments and exposition. I'd like to ask the next question to Timur Eron. Mr. Timur Eron is an associate in Morrison Cohen LLP's corporate and family office departments, where his practice concentrates on mergers and acquisitions, venture capital, private equity investments, and general corporate services for U.S. subsidiaries of foreign corporations and family office groups. Timur brings a client-side perspective to the firm as a co-founder of 2 investment companies that provided private financial and direct investments in real estate for high net worth individuals and institutions. Additionally, he has international investment banking and in-house legal experience at well-known investment firms. He's a graduate of University of Chicago and Columbia Law School. Timur, investors could choose to apply for the EB-5 visa via direct, that's actively managed enterprise, or regional center, that is passive methodology. Needless to say, managing their life in the US once they've gotten the EB-5 visa for investors from these 2 groups will be quite different. Even though most Turkish investors choose the regional center route, many wonder about what they will actually do when they get here. These are professionals, doctors, lawyers, and business persons who excel in their respective fields. What advice could we give them for company formation procedures and preparatory work while waiting for the EB-5 visa in their home country? Thank you, Timur.
Thank you. So there's a few general buckets, and the facts and circumstances of each individual client is going to vary radically. So I don't want to go into detailed case studies necessarily. But as John had said, first you want to be able to prepare beforehand before you actually come here. But when you're actually here, you're going to want to be able to offer, or at least refer people to the full panoply of individual client services. So, what we do is, one major question they might have is, okay, they have the $500,000, but then how do they get other funds here? One thing that we do with them is back-to-back letters of credit. So they can monetize that with their local home bank that they have a good credit history with, and then basically get that in the US and access those funds. And actually that's very popular because, given the economic climate in Turkey right now, a lot of them don't want to sell their homes. And so basically, the funds that they can access, the loan to value on those is significantly higher. And so that's one little selling point. If you're familiar with those sorts of strategies, you can talk about it, then pique their interest, and that's another value add. Sometimes, and this can apply for a lot of jurisdictions, it might be uncomfortable sending out money abroad. One other thing that we've done is, set up kind of captive insurance platforms for people. So they get that in, you can even monetize and fund that through the back-to-back LCs. And then for all intents and purposes, you're buying insurance on your factory. You're not sending money out. So that's one way. That how do you actually fund it? And then the basics like setting up your own bank accounts, hand-holding them through the KYC. So those sorts of initial steps. Then the other thing is when they're actually here, a lot of them, from my experience, they don't really want to work anymore a full-time job. And a lot of them have experience with real estate in their home country. In Turkey, everyone, say about 50% of the people that are very wealthy made their money through there, some sort of related industry, cement or management, or construction management. So they're very familiar and very comfortable. And they're always asking, okay, if I'm going to be here, how am I actually going to make money? And especially you don't want to be relying on wherever the lira conversion rate is in 2 years' time and liquidate and then perhaps have significantly less money every time you transfer funds. So, we get a lot of them into real estate funds. We'll set up their own little LLCs. They might ask, again, sometimes they Google, and they might ask, well, what about, Reno Trusts? I heard some family, Turkish families went there. Tell me about Delaware. What are the various state level, tax implications? Also, that ties into where should they live? Probably Florida. They love Miami. So you kill two birds with one stone with low personal income tax or overall blended tax rate. And also, I wanted to touch on the interesting thing with, sort of semi-passive investment strategies is that you can do that with an E2. So you can get here. You spend $100,000 on an office condo in a small area, you have a secretary, part-time analyst, you lease a car, so now you fulfilled, the investment requirements. And then we have a few people who are just killing time and they co-invest into deal flow. And so by the time they get their green card through the EB-5 program, they're already fairly well set up and they have the ability to sustain themselves without FX risk. And some of the other people just set up the family branch, local branch of their family's company. We had one person who came in taking advantage of some of the environmental law rollbacks that have gone on in the US and makes buying coal here actually more advantageous. So he came in and set up his family's whole subsidiary operations and just tying into their general supply chain. So I think, where am I going with this? It's that there's a good value add to be able to talk about some of the unique things that you can bring. Again, at surface level, you don't want to go too far into details, and then when you bring in the specialists, they might contradict you, and that's never a good thing. And then it's important, as John was saying, to tie into the network of consultants, and other professionals, so that you're not just calling them the day of when you have a potential client relationship. So, for instance, we've all actually done some stuff together to varying degrees. So if I have somebody, I'll refer them or, get back and forth. And it's pretty seamless right now. So, those are my general closing points. I can talk about some of these other things ad nauseum. I actually really like it. But, yeah.
Thank you, Timur. At this point, let's talk about the critical elements an investor should look at when selecting a project. This is a general question, but the EB5 landscape is changing so fast that the answer to this question is also changing with the market. While a comprehensive answer to this question is beyond the scope of this panel, let's try to at least list some of the big picture items here. For example, we know that retrogression leads to reinvestment risk. In picking projects, Turkish investors should be cognizant that some projects are in their initial stages, some are middle of the road, and some are almost completed. We're seeing more and more I-924 exemplar-proof projects out there that give job creation comfort. But while the applicant is waiting I-829 adjudication, is there a trade-off between getting green card certainty and potentially having to wait for the funds until the second project could create funds to pay off AB5 investors? I must say, this is one of the most common questions we're getting from our investors today. There's really no textbook answer here other than giving our clients the comfort that Turkish investors are not facing retrogression today, like some of the other countries, like China and Vietnam. If the client gets into a project which is almost completed, and the project either gets refinanced or sold rather quickly, then following the repayment of senior loan there would indeed be a reinvestment risk. Therefore, one needs to be very careful in picking not only the project, but the project sponsor as well. In these cases, the experience, reputation, and track record of the developer and the regional center are just as important as the project. If the project is in the middle or early stages of development, then chances are good that I-829 adjudication will align rather nicely with expected repayment, grossly reducing reinvestment risk.
So other important considerations are funding, composition, and the waterfall. Is EB5 ahead of developers' equity? Now you might say, what kind of consideration is that? You would be surprised that at least we have seen that there are transactions out there where this is not necessarily the case, where basically the EB5 is below the equity. On the funding composition, how much EB5 reliance is there? We like to see a good chunk of senior debt from a reputable lender. And basically we say if the LTV for a senior reputable lender is 60%, for our EB5 investor, it's good enough to have 75%. If it's good enough for, I'm just going to throw out the JP Morgan name, like a 60%, for our EB5 investor, it's okay to have a 70%. But if there's absolutely no lender out there and our EB5 investor is senior, that's not so good as far as we're concerned. It's a personal opinion. It's there could be other opinions out there which I would totally respect. And then also we like to see a healthy chunk of equity below the EB5 in the transaction. A project appraisal that clearly shows that the value will be created well ahead of the total spend. So not only an equity, a skin in the game from the developer, but when we look at the total spend and the appraisal, we'd like to see that, for example, 1 + 1 = 3, something like that. As for job creation, we like to see minimum 20-30% cushion. And going back to funding, we're always searching for transactions where EB5 funds are nice to have, but not must have. In other words, they are simply refinancing a mezzanine debt below the senior debt. And lastly, restriction on additional indebtedness. This is something that we look for, and admittedly, almost no project has it. But if you were to find a project where the developer is not allowed to dilute the EB5, a rarity, I think that's an amazing thing. So at its core, because EB5 investment needs to be done as equity rather than fixed income, selecting the right partner as the developer and regional center is of utmost importance. So as I said in the beginning, if you have any further project selection related questions, we all will be around to answer your questions after our session. So let's move along for the next question, if I may ask. Alternatives to EB5. Perhaps the most relevant one for Turkish citizens is E2. While the E2 visa is not a permanent solution and needs to be periodically renewed, it does get processed relatively quickly, especially when compared with EB5. Could you please comment on the advantages of E2 in this regard, as well as give a roadmap to people who view E2 as a complementary step to EB5? Could you also provide a general timeline for Turkish investors to decide on and prepare on EB5, any EB5 application?
Turkish investors, professionals are pretty knowledgeable about E2 visas, and E2 visas have been utilized in Turkey for significant numbers. I found that the U.S. consulate in Istanbul, where we process the E2 visa cases, is very business-oriented, professional, and liberal. And Turkish investors are highly educated for E2 visas, and it's among the most used visas that I work on. I think the best option for the E2 visas is that the investor will have the choice to enter into the US in much shorter time and explore the business market, and then extend the investment if they like to go for direct investment, or even consider the regional center investment after they have the residency in the US. And E2 visas are processed in Istanbul, I would say, in 8 to 10 weeks, and considerably short time. And the US consulate is very knowledgeable for Turkey's market conditions, economy, documents, the businesses' backgrounds. And the visas are issued 99% of the time for 5 years for multiple entries, which creates a significant alternative to enter into the US in very short time before the investor can explore the EB5 options. The most important issue to be careful about, what I found, is that if the investor has a significant interest for an EB5 application in future, they need to be well prepared for investment before E2 is filed, because the US consulate's legal source of the funds requirements are significantly lighter than the immigration services requirements. And if the client is not prepared well in advance about how to invest into E2 enterprise, which could become a significant problem in future to convert the investment, use the initial funds for EB5 purposes as well. But from my personal experience, E2 visas are used in a lot of different fields, starting from IT, software development, to food services industry, to schools, educational institutions, to pet stores, and highly educated investor profile. Franchising had become a significant interest among the investors to start with smaller investments with E2 and convert back to EB5. But also just to get the E2 to have a business and move the residency and file with the regional center in future.
Thank you, Simona. Okay, next, I may ask Emre. Today and looking ahead, we all know the tremendous backlog with the Chinese mainland-born applicants. And we just alluded to this before. It appears like retrogression is around the corner for Vietnam and maybe possibly at one point India. Today there is no such fear for Turkish applicants. Do we have a sense for how many more Turkish applications would be necessary for Turkey to face this kind of retrogression? In your response to this question, could you please touch upon the current waiting period for each step along the process and what it would become should there be retrogression?
Hi, Marco. The numbers in Turkey are really so, at this point, unreliable with respect to 2018. So speculating on what it would take for them to slip into retrogression, I don't really think there's a whole lot of value doing that. I think we're far enough away from retrogression that really the focus should be on sort of how do we ramp up the numbers. When it comes to processing timelines for Turkish investors, I always make sure to go through that process with them and explain, that most of the deals are structured as either 5 or 7 year deals for a reason, and that under the best of circumstances, you're looking at a 5-year process. Inevitably, I'll get the questions about retrogression, but I think Turkey's so far off from that I never really want to sort of scare off the client, because most of these people are doing it for either their college-age children who are in the United States and looking to adjust, or children who are in high school approaching college age. So retrogression would really take EB-5 off the table for most of these candidates. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. Let's talk about stay requirements. Some applicants would like to move to the US as soon as possible. I get this question, they say, I want to be there yesterday. And then we spoke about it too as an interim solution for them, for these people who want to be here rather quickly. Others are already here and do not want to become out of status. I mean, as you mentioned, such as students who are about to graduate, or those who are here working on different visas like N1, E2, H1B. And finally, some people are thinking of coming to the United States on a permanent basis due to their professional commitments, and are not sure whether they will be ready by the time the conditional green card is approved. What piece of advice could we give them to these type of groups?
All right, I'll try to keep it as short as possible. I know we're out of time. But like Emre mentioned, EB-5 cases are most common for students, and most of the time they are already in the US with the student visas, and the parents are knowledgeable enough to manage the time before the school and the OPT period would end, that they would secure their EB-5 approvals. And for the other applicants, E-visas and L visas are very easily used. So I think that's why Turkey is one of the easiest locations to process EB-5 cases.
Are there any questions for the panel? Any questions for the Turkey panel? If there are no questions.
We do have one more that we could cover.
Oh, there's one more point? Okay, if you want to cover one more point, we have
If there isn't from the
one more
audience,
time. Yeah.
I'd like to ask the last question to Emre, if I may. We're hearing some horror stories from some of our clients and prospects that there are many hope merchants, umut taciri as we say in Turkish, out there, who are not licensed and fabricate stories only to lure investors and make unrealistic promises. For example, unlicensed hope merchants lead potential investors to believing that an EB-5 visa application is possible when a foreign investor purchases a property in the US. When it comes down to the bottom line, there are always two questions we get from the get-go from any potential investor from Turkey or anywhere else. One, will I truly get my green card through this process? And two, will I get my money back? What word of advice could we give these folks on the first question, and what kind of comfort could we provide regarding the second question? Thanks, Emre.
These were questions that I used to get inevitably right from the get-go a good 5-10 years ago. which were sometimes challenging to answer with any sort of confidence. But I think that since the EB5 Regional Center model has really taken off to post Lehman Brothers, we've got a good 10 years of data and statistics. And so what I'll tell clients is that the regional centers, in an effort to market, will post their statistics on their 526 approval rates, their 829s, and number of investors with return funds, and how long it took. And so I tell them that part of the due diligence process is really to evaluate and analyze statistics that are available, and you can answer both those questions with most of the information that's now out there. It's not really a mystery, and there's quite a bit of media coverage too. And so I think that I sort of I take those questions and I turn them back around on the people that are assisting the clients doing the due diligence process, and usually that will sort of take care of any concerns that they might have when they've got hard facts in front of them, statistics to go by.
Agreed. Companies like ours who are have the obligation, responsibility, and hopefully the experience to be able to analyze these projects and not advise, but at least point out the relevant points of comfort and of the reverse of comfort in the projects, and then have the clients make the educated decisions. And that's exactly what we're trying to do as well. So why don't I ask one more time if there is any question. I guess either we did a great job, you have no questions because we covered everything, or I don't know. So I'm just going to assume that was the case.
No?
Yes.
One point. Anyone? No? Okay, Turkey panel, thank you so much. You did a fantastic job. Very, very informative. Thank you. A big round of applause.